It's the week ending Saturday the 28th of March, and this is the Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Boris Johnson declaring a UK lockdown. The gunman of the Christchurch shootings pleading guilty to 51 counts of murder, and people from all across the world coming together to cringe over celebs singing John Lennon's Imagine. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me from the week's digital team, it's Joe Evans and James Ashford. And from the week junior, it's Felicity Capon. And we are all staying at home and protecting lives. How are you all doing?
Yeah, quite mad, I think, at this point. Yeah, talking to myself more and more every day.
Well, Joe, you're up first, so well done. You get to talk to someone else. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Could virtual protests become a new reality?
In cyberspace, it's the protesters who have the upper hand. A meme can be mightier than a Molotov cocktail. Online chat groups are full of agitprop and plans for the next demo. Proposals are floated on social media, locations, timings, tactics. People then vote them up or down.
So it is very organic, and the worst idea will be eliminated. It's just and the best survives. By the upvoting mechanism, people can choose the best step coming next.
A clip from BBC Newsnight there about how technology is changing protests. In that case, obviously, they were talking about Hong Kong. But Joe, the story you found this week is in Israel.
Yes, so more than 500,000 Israelis have taken part in what has become known as a virtual protest against the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. In an event broadcast on Facebook Live over the weekend, around 600,000 people tuned in and watched sort of celebrities and judges and former security chiefs basically denounce Netanyahu. The protest was all held via Facebook because the government has asked people to stay indoors for exactly the same reason that we're recording remotely today, because of the ongoing coronavirus pandemic.
And what specifically were they protesting? Obviously, Israel's had a pretty turbulent time over the last year in terms of contested elections and so on.
Yes, Netanyahu has basically been accused of using the coronavirus as a way to sort of strengthen his power. He's been accused, first of all, of using it to delay an oncoming corruption trial. He did this by very cannily banning meetings of more than 10 people in a public place, which would have made it impossible for them to actually get into a courtroom and try him. He's also called for an emergency government to be formed to deal with the pandemic, which came after he lost a September 2019 election. So in other words, he has been accused of sort of cynically electioneering and manoeuvring to use the coronavirus pandemic in his favour.
But you're linking this to Hong Kong because I guess what you're saying is there's a suite of technologies that are available now. It's been visible this week because people have been asked to stay at home in Israel, but it's something that underpins kind of all protest movements now, social media.
Yes, so protesters using sort of social media and the internet to organise is nothing new, and we've seen that happen in Lebanon very recently, where dissidents have used sort of Facebook and Twitter to sort of disseminate information where sort of normal news networks aren't available due to government crackdowns. We also saw it very widely during the Arab Spring, where sort of Facebook and Twitter and YouTube massively bolstered the protests. What's slightly newer is these fully digitised protests and rallies, as you saw in Israel over the weekend, where the entire rally takes place online and there's no sort of physical boots on the ground march or meetings out in public places.
Doesn't that make it rather easier, Felicity, to ignore? I mean, if the whole thing's happening online, the government can simply not look at it, say it's not happening. There aren't people outside the building, so let's just forget that this is happening.
I don't know. I think I'm sort of heartened by the idea that even in such unprecedented times, the idea that people can find new ways to protest is actually, you know, a good thing. And I suppose for lots of authoritarian countries, they could use this pandemic as an excuse for a crackdown in all sorts of ways, especially the idea that people can't physically meet up and protest and organise and all that sort of thing. I still think it has the power to generate a tremendous response and a problem for governments, the idea that people still can find ways to protest online. But as Joe was saying, it is in some ways it is nothing new, the idea that Twitter and Facebook have been used to sort of galvanise movements. But I think there's also been a lot of cynicism as to whether it actually works and it's effective. There was a famous article in the New Yorker, which is slightly old now. I think it was from 2010. It was Malcolm Gladwell, and the title was "Small Change, the Revolution Will Not Be Tweeted." And he was sort of saying that the problem with Facebook is that you're creating very, very loose, weak links between people compared to some of the more famous civil rights movements in the US in the 60s, when people had to meet up and there was very clear lines of authority and there was discipline and you had a hierarchy, and that's what you needed to bring about real change, strategies. Whereas the idea of sort of online clicktivism, how much change is that actually going to bring about?
Yeah, and that's where the idea of slacktivism came about, isn't it, James? This concept that actually it's easier to click a link, it's easier to share a hashtag, and so it doesn't really mean as much as the people who are prepared to go out on the streets.
Yeah, I suppose in this case you can't criticise people for doing what they're told and staying at home, because that's something that we're all making a global effort to do. So I think we have to kind of separate that issue of whether virtual protests are going to be useful in the future and whether they're just necessary now. I do totally agree though that the slacktivism, just sharing links on your Facebook page or posting something on Twitter, is completely separate from people who are actually putting the time and effort in to go out onto the streets and let it be known that they're unhappy with something or want change. But I do think obviously it is a massively useful tool for organising that more public outside protest. So obviously you've got stuff like this, and you had the Arab Spring, as you mentioned earlier, Hong Kong, but there are also smaller groups who are doing it. So I know XR, for instance, I was speaking to someone who's involved in that, and they were telling me that they organise a lot of the things that they do via a WhatsApp group, and they have local WhatsApp groups for lots of different cells, if you like, of Extinction Rebellion, so they can organise which things they can do next.
Joe, so far everyone has said this isn't new, including you. So why is this your story of the week? What are the implications from this week that are different?
So this, as I say, the section of this that is fairly new is the fully digitised process, as opposed to what we're kind of drifting into talking about, which is the sort of organisation of things online.
Okay, but where do you see that going?
So the reason that I think the digital process is slightly more interesting is because, as Felicity rightly pointed out, authoritarian governments very quickly clamp down on what you're able to do in sort of public places. It was seen in Hong Kong, which we've already talked about. And there's a lot of people sort of in places like Chile, especially where there's been protests in favour of a new constitution, where campaigners have sort of said, we have to continue to organise during, for example, the pandemic, because if they lose momentum, the government will be able to do whatever it wants. Bloomberg has reported that in Hong Kong they also did one of these digitised protests. The Hong Kong Civil Assembly team, the pro-democracy group, held an online rally in early March, again due to the fact that the pandemic had meant that people couldn't go outside, and also, frankly, because lots of Hong Kongers are very terrified of going out on the streets when the police are firing rubber bullets and throwing bricks around and things. For that reason, I think the digital protests do have legs, in that they allow protest groups to sustain themselves both when authoritarian governments crack down on what you can do publicly outside, and also when, for reasons like the pandemic that aren't kind of easily forecasted, momentum could very easily be lost.
Yeah, and I think there's evidence from regimes we've seen throughout history that people communicating to each other, even in private, can have a massive effect on undermining a dictator's power. So things like jokes being banned in people's households, if that's being outlawed by the powers that be, then you can see that actually having, a much broader, bigger, seditious network of people communicating to undermine the government can make a massive difference.
I wonder as well, Felicity, whether the difference about this story now, as opposed to when it was first being talked about in the Arab Spring 10 years ago, is that actually genuinely now this technology is in not everyone's pocket, but the majority of people's pockets. They have a phone that connects to the internet, that can allow encryption, that has a good microphone and camera. These are the things that we're all using to work from home at the moment. They are the things that could be used to mobilise protest movements in a way that perhaps probably wasn't really true 10 years ago of all groups in society.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. I think it has, in some ways, this pandemic has shown that technology is kind of there, and more people are aware of how to use it effectively and efficiently to work and to connect with people. And this whole idea that actually we are alone and isolated in our homes, but we're more connected than ever. has shown that to be the case. Even the idea of a hashtag, like I was reading an interesting article about, I think it was like 2007 when the hashtag was invented, and the way that's, and I remember at the time, I still, when you were watching like a TV program or something and a hashtag would come up on the screen and I would be like, what does that mean? Now it's just second nature that there's hashtags and what they're used for, and the ways that they can bring about whole movements like the Me Too movement, hashtag Me Too, which, whatever you think about that, was still an incredible way for people to open up and about, abuse that had affected them. So yeah, I think whatever you think about online protests, it's very much the case that technology has evolved at a staggering pace to enable us to connect like, never before. It's extraordinary, really.
It's not a surprising story that a large number of people would take to Facebook to protest Netanyahu, because we know a large number of people voted against him. But we also know that he hasn't convincingly lost a number of elections, which is why he's still there. So, it doesn't really... it's a bit like Brexit was here. We know that the country is divided there. So what surprises are there? Even if half the nation joins in, well, that's what you'd expect.
Maybe I'm slightly less cynical on the topic of protests than others, but I think, as I say, it's easy to sort of pick cynically at these movements, and I think it's easy to pick cynically at protest movements generally. Having said that, on the occasions that protest movements do have a massive impact, they have a huge seismic impact. Yes, you can point to Brexit, or you can point to the March Against the War in Iraq. That both perfectly valid examples of movements that didn't do a lot. You could then point to the Arab Spring and look at the number of kind of despotic leaders that were disposed and say, despotic leaders that were removed from office, and say, well, that's an example of a protest movement that did brilliantly. I think, as I say, the difficulty is going to be, and this is something the Arab Spring did very, very well, is combining the ease of connectivity with the sort of willingness to get out on the street and risk people's lives in situations like the Arab Spring. And I think that's the massive sort of step that digital protests and virtual protests will have to take if they're going to be effective.
Okay, well, I'm going to show a willingness to get out of this conversation and move us on. Felicity, you are up next after this. Okay, Felicity, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
A glimmer of good news from the animal kingdom.
African rhinos have long been under threat.
We have almost a military style of protecting them. That means very good security, very good intelligence, and very rapid response to any threats.
Near Kenya's capital, rangers and law enforcement tranquilize this one. They drill its horn to insert a tracking device. It's part of a wider effort to increase the species and ensure viable breeding.
CEO of Wildlife Direct, Paula Kahumbu, speaking to Al Jazeera. Felicity, what's the story?
So the good news is that African black rhinos in the wild, their numbers have risen by several hundred in the past few years. So this is a moderate success story for conservation. So in 2012...
So how many are there now?
In 2012, there were 4,845, and that has risen to 5,630 in 2018. So that's a 2.5% annual rise. So it's not crazy numbers, but it is still a little bit of good news that I'm definitely holding on to in these dark days.
Yeah, I imagine this plays well in the Week Junior, this kind of story. You're always looking for good news, yeah.
Yeah, we were all over this.
And also you bring environmental concerns onto the podcast a lot as well. So why has this happened? I mean, it is presumably the results of campaigning and momentum and people understanding that conservation is something that should be done.
Yeah, I think it's sheer kind of painstaking hard work. And I think that's why, even if the numbers don't sound absolutely incredible, they are a cause to be celebrated. There's been lots of different strategies and ways of bringing this about. So moving individuals to new locations has been a big thing. So rhinos that are happily settled in the areas they are, sort of moving them into new environments where they can set up new and effective breeding models. It's been protecting them through stronger law enforcement. It's going after poachers in new and effective ways. Poaching is still a massive threat to rhinos as they go after their horns. So it seems to be a kind of multifaceted strategy that is bearing the fruit.
You said there was good news, which we've heard. Does that mean there's some bad news too?
So white rhinos are still in trouble. White rhinos have bigger horns than black rhinos, so they're even more highly coveted for poachers. And actually, subspecies of black rhinos are still critically endangered. So the southeastern and eastern black rhinos are still not doing so well. But and there are concerns, for example, about how coronavirus will affect ecotourism and all that sort of thing. So it's very kind of a fragile good news story. But it made me think, well, why do we want to kind of protect endangered animals? What's the benefit for it? And why are these you read it and it is such good news, and you're thinking, why are these humans and governments and people working so hard to protect endangered animals? And it just got me thinking about that, really, about, do we understand the benefits of biodiversity?
Well, one of the crude answers to that question would be because it benefits the local economy. I mean, this is one of the reasons that people have got behind conservation in recent years, isn't it? And James, Felicity just mentioned their ecotourism. If people aren't seeing it in their wallets, if it doesn't benefit them to protect rhinos anymore, if the sale price in the market for selling them for meat or whatever they were up to before ivory and all the rest of it is better than tourism, then that's what will happen to animals like this.
Yeah, I mean, sadly, I think you might be right, especially given that the cost of protecting those animals is so high. I mean, a conservation study from 2012, so a long time ago now, said it would cost $76 billion a year to preserve all threatened land animals, and that doesn't even take into account marine animals. Obviously, it would have grown more than then. We've heard that the cost of keeping rhinos alone has risen greatly in the last decade. So it's a hugely expensive endeavour. And I think also, there's not just a fiscal cost, but there's also a real cost to people's lives in trying to conserve animals. So even last year we saw a 22-year-old British soldier from the Coldstream Guards was killed by an elephant whilst he was on anti-poaching patrol in Malawi. And you have to start thinking, if we're putting so much resource and even risking people's lives to protect animals, in the name of conservation, are we perhaps putting animals ahead of people in some regard?
So I think that the most obvious answer to that is that animals are going extinct at a far faster rate than they've ever done before. And it's all well and good saying, animals do go extinct and this happens. And that's true to a degree, obviously. The issue being that the extinction rate has increased 100-fold in the last century. And one of the big reasons for it increasing so rapidly is human behaviour, trashing of environments around the world, massive emissions from kind of human business endeavour. And so I think it's fine to say, it is a very expensive endeavour, and you're right to point out, Ollie, that a lot of people sort of back these measures because it kind of benefits them financially. There's places sort of like Chiang Mai in Thailand, for example, where there's almost an entire kind of industry built around one place that's all completely reliant on elephant sanctuaries. Having said that, when it's human behaviour that is sort of causing the extinction rate to rapidly increase, I think then it's fair to say that we have some responsibility to try and conserve animals when we sort of regularly trash their natural environment.
And so how, Felicity, can that message really be spread at a time when, many people listening to this will feel it seems a bit like it's us that's under threat of extinction at the moment, obviously not 100%, but it's a time when people are going to struggle to focus on the welfare of animals.
Yes, but I think there are lots of ways of communicating the benefits of protecting biodiversity. It's not just that, Planet Earth, David Attenborough, we love animals, they're fascinating and majestic and they give us joy, and the world would be a terrible place if we didn't have rhinos roaming anymore. There are also kind of very cold and like the cold facts of protecting biodiversity, that it actually brings in trillions of pounds to global economies. And I think it goes back to this lack of understanding that we don't actually understand biodiversity very, very well.
So in what ways then, so we've covered ecotourism, how else does animal conservation benefit the economy?
If you're protecting a certain species of animal, it means you're also going to have to protect the environment that they inhabit. And that's the point of biodiversity. It's all interconnected. And if you just think about the essentials of life that we need, so oxygen, food, coffee, chips, all that sort of thing, our whole lives rely on biodiversity. And actually, if if you got rid of it, it would be incredibly expensive for human existence. So if we were in a spaceship with no biodiversity, we probably could survive, but it would be incredibly expensive to get everything we need that we already have from the natural world.
Okay, but connect rhinos to chips for me.
Well, it's the idea that everything is interconnected. It's not just the rhinos, it's where they live and it's their knock-on effect to the animals and the habitats around them.
So it's similar to what we've talked about before with declining bee populations, that bees pollinate flowers build up forests provide oxygen, etc.
Exactly. There was a very interesting case study of Thai shrimp farmers who were getting rid of mangroves in order to set up these shrimp farms. And ostensibly, it appeared as if the net returns economically were much better if you set up these shrimp farms. But actually, when biologists really studied it over a period of 5 to 10 years, it was devastating for the economy to be getting rid of these mangroves, because in terms of the benefits they brought to the local area in terms of like flood defences and that sort of thing. So again, it's sort of thinking it's not just the immediate, if we strip back forests and get rid of this and that, it's thinking long term that actually there's sort of all sorts of harm that you can reap if you start removing key bits of the planet. And that's why I think these stories about rhinos, it's not just, good news, rhinos are so cool. It's actually, you need to think more seriously about the long-term economic benefits. And also, I think, again, it's this is a bit of an old example, but just as an example of how animals and the nature around them all kind of interconnects. A really famous example is reintroducing wolves in Yellowstone National Park. So they were reintroduced in 1995, having gone extinct there. And the knock-on effect they had to their surroundings was absolutely incredible. It meant that as predators, they were hunting deer. So deer were avoiding areas where they were more likely to be easy prey. In these areas, you saw plants that could grow again. So willow and aspen started flourishing. With willow and aspen flourishing, you saw more bugs and more birds return to them. This brought back about beavers, and it also meant, rather incredibly, that riverbanks started stabilising in Yellowstone National Park because there was increased vegetation there. So if you want an example of how, protecting wildlife and getting it back to how it should be can have incredible knock-on effects to the entire surroundings, Yellowstone.
Yeah.
I'm convinced.
Apart from pandas, let's just let them die. They are just not willing to cooperate, are they?
Well, on that bombshell, James, you're up next after this. James, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Whether it's time for celebrities to get out of here.
What are you doing with them? I mean, that's not a little weird. But I mean, do you have like horses or cattle or farm or?
Well, the modern ranch, 21st century ranch, is really land management. It is, you lease the mineral rights to oil companies and you sell water to oil companies, and then you lease the grazing rights to different ranchers. So it's land management.
RuPaul talking to Terry Gross on the NPR podcast Fresh Air. James, what's the story here?
Well, so RuPaul, who's very famous and a big inspiration to lots of young people, is a host of a TV show called RuPaul's Drag Race. And he was having this conversation with Terry Gross on the ironically named Fresh Air podcast when he admitted that he sells the rights to his 60,000-acre Wyoming ranch to oil companies to what appears to be for fracking. So there's been a big...
Yeah, it's important to say he hasn't confirmed that, has he? He didn't say for definite that he's fracking.
Well, he hasn't confirmed that his land is being used for fracking, but there are a website called Frack Tracker, which essentially collects data on fracking sites, shows that huge areas of RuPaul's land are used for oil and gas wells, including an estimated 35 active oil and gas wells on just 10,000 acres of his property, and he's got 60,000. So I think we can be fairly certain that RuPaul is involved in fracking.
But the surprise here, James, well, I suppose apart from the fact that RuPaul lives on a ranch, that's maybe a surprise. But the other surprise is that it's him. I mean, if it was another celebrity who was a bit less renowned for being a kind of hero to, inclusive rights, if it was Clint Eastwood or Kid Rock and they said, yes, part of my land is used for fracking, that probably wouldn't exactly set the internet alight. This is a surprise to people because they attribute certain values to RuPaul, which in a sense is not his concern when he's deciding what to do with his land.
Well, I disagree. See, I think it is his concern because, yes, he has a lot of progressive values and people look to him for that, but he has also explicitly said that he's worried about climate change. He in fact held a climate change themed episode of his show before, and he's got one of the funny things I read whilst looking into this was that one of the guest judges on the 12th season of his show will be Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, who's recently introduced a bill in the House which bans all fracking by 2025. And I do wonder whether they're now destined to have quite a difficult conversation when recording that show.
Or are they not, Felicity? Because at the end of the day, it's an entertainment show. Does it really matter, ultimately, when you cut through this, whether or not people on the panel have different views on fracking?
I'm not sure people are going to really care. It's weird, isn't it, with celebrities? I think your brain, you just either like them or you don't like them, and you can make up all sorts of excuses for their weird and wacky behaviour to sort of suit your narrative of how you choose to view them. But I do think celebrity endorsement in general is very, very interesting. I think it's sort of like a double-edged sword, isn't it, for brands, because that celebrity has to kind of really be... I mean, that's that element of trust, isn't it? They have to be this trusted celebrity. And if they sort of, if there's some sort of bad behaviour or there's some sort of scandal, a brand can sort of live or die by what this celebrity then chooses to do. And it made me think of, anyone remember Ryan Lochte, the Olympian swimmer in 2016 who...
Joe and James are nodding, I should say, for the record, because we're watching them on Zoom, but they seem to have forgotten that the audio component is necessary for you listening.
Well, Ryan Lochte was this US swimmer who had very, very decorated and won all these Olympic medals, and then got into hot water when he exaggerated claims of an armed robbery in Brazil, which he said he'd had a gun held up his head and all this, and he was promptly dropped by 4 of his sponsors. So it's quite interesting to see how brands then have to react when they do get when the people who are representing their brand do get into hot water. Although I suppose the flip side of that is that it gives some brands and companies they can make a big sing song and dance about cutting off their ties with someone and sort of saying, sort of a virtue signalling exercise, like we will no longer have anything to do with Ryan Lochte. So I do think it's interesting. And obviously Kate Moss and Burberry was the other one that when she, the allegations of her taking cocaine came to light, and I think she was dropped by Burberry. But then I think Burberry actually picked her back up again because I think they thought it might regenerate their brand a bit, that they wouldn't be seen to be so stuffy. So, but it is interesting, isn't it? I always think of Gary Lineker and Walkers. I mean, he's just great. Everyone loves Gary Lineker, don't they?
Then again, you say he hasn't put it foot wrong, and I would agree, but there are lots of people who wouldn't agree, because even Gary Lineker...
because he's a Remainer, that was the thing, wasn't it?
Not just a Remainer, but when he just stuck up for refugees, there was a huge backlash from people just completely saying, oh, we used to like you, thought you were great, and now we're not bothered, just because he, I think along with Lily Allen, they were sticking up for refugees, saying really, innocuous things, just something along the lines of, isn't it awful that child refugees are dying? And people went, no, I'm not having that, that's outrageous, you lefty, and people got fed up with him. So you can say the most normal, reasonable thing and people will hate you for it if they don't share your opinion. And it's another thing that I was thinking was when Felicity was talking about all the people who have been dropped by advertisers, there's also lots of cases of people who haven't been dropped. So Cristiano Ronaldo at the moment is still, earning millions and millions of pounds every year through sponsorship deals. He's still one of the most widely revered footballers in the world, and yet he's faced credible rape accusations against him and had to make payouts to a woman who accused him of rape. Kobe Bryant, who very sadly for his family died earlier this year, but he was dropped briefly by McDonald's in 2014 when he faced credible rape accusations.
Surely the conclusion of all this kind of thing, though, Joe, is to say, OK, so if celebrities go on the record and say they are for or against a particular political thing, that means that they cannot ever act in contradiction to that. And since we all know that people are nuanced, we should stop having any kind of celebrity endorsement at all, and people with positions of power and responsibility should stop saying what they think about stuff. I mean, those things aren't realistic in terms of how people work or how business works.
I think it would be very sad if celebrities were to stop using their platforms to talk about things precisely because they're worried about that. And I agree that the nuance, people are nuanced and people don't have sort of one single opinion that is consistent throughout their entire existence. And I think most normal people that aren't famous and aren't endorsing things left, right and centre would recognise that within themselves. There's a very famous example of Alec Baldwin, who did an advert for Capital One Bank. And at the time, the Occupy Wall Street movement was taking place, and he was a very vocal supporter of that as well.
You and your protests.
And I know, I just love a protest. Incidentally, Alec Baldwin is worth $65 million, so if he's concerned about inequality, redistribution starts at home, Alec. But he got in trouble because Capital One...
He also needs a good bank account, to be fair.
Capital One received a $3.5 billion bailout in the financial crash, and then his support for Occupy Wall Street was seen as slightly hypocritical. And I think it's that hypocrisy that people love to sort of pull out and to sort of slam celebrities for, when, as you quite rightly point out, Ollie, people are nuanced, people are complicated, and people's opinions may not always be completely consistent with those that people who don't know celebrities have sort of projected onto them. And I think that's where sort of the tension and the contradiction within celebrity endorsements often comes from.
And
it also shows, James, this example, maybe I would say this as a podcaster, but it shows how in a long-form interview, when someone's guard is down, they'll say something that's actually much more interesting than what they think they're on there to say. I mean, this was in the sort of 60th minute of this hour-long conversation, and the host didn't actually follow up with RuPaul, really. She just said, what's it like to live on a ranch? But it was, the Twitterati afterwards who said, hold on, did RuPaul just say that he gets money from fracking?
I totally agree. Yeah, it's really weird, isn't it, that she didn't follow up. It just feels like such a missed opportunity. It does remind me what you were just saying then. We had a conversation a couple of months ago about when Daisy Ridley said that she felt that she was very hard done to because of her background. And that was like a tiny little nugget in an otherwise perfectly reasonable interview. But just when you get those little snippets of people's real thoughts when they're not media trained and that something slips through, that's when it's most interesting. And I think that with sports stars and things, you almost never get a hint of their personality. You might see them going on the TV to advertise Pepsi, but they're never allowed to say anything because they know, and advertisers know, that as soon as they start speaking, people will have a problem with that. So I think Joe's right that it's good that people can talk out, because otherwise you do just get a bunch of kind of homogenized, very similar types of people not saying anything particularly insightful, and all interviews will basically start replicating kind of post-match football interviews. And that would be a shame, because some celebrities do actually have valuable things to say. So you've got huge stars like Emma Watson sticking up for women's rights, or Angelina Jolie, who's gone to go and visit refugee camps and tried to draw attention to the plight of refugees. So I think the point is, it's maybe, acceptable if people are going to use their voice or use their platform or image to sell products. They also kind of have a duty to use it to do something for good. So maybe they can draw attention to an issue and help people, which is not...
It's interesting as well, Felicity, that he didn't ask for it to be edited out. I mean, he didn't seem to know that he dropped a bomb.
Well, I mean, but fracking also has lots of supporters. It's controversial. I wonder whether it's the fact that he doesn't actually see that it's a problem at all. He might actually think it is a really good idea, as so many people do. Maybe he just hasn't thought it through. Maybe he doesn't have an agent or someone telling him, like, let's keep this on the down low, hush, hush, we don't know how this is going to affect your reputation. Or maybe he is just loud and proud fracking fan. Who knows?
It was very strange how he did just sort of drop it as if he didn't think it was a problematic thing to be saying, and as if he didn't sort of realise that his fan base might think it was a problematic thing to be saying. It slightly reminded me of Liam Neeson when he gave that sort of bizarre interview to The Independent and just revealed, I won't go into the details of the story, so I feel like everyone knows it, but like basically revealed that he'd gone around London looking for black people to attack because his friend had been attacked. And sort of, he wasn't pushed to say it, the interviewer wasn't trying to draw it out of him. He just decided to reveal that totally bizarre thought process as if the world was going to go, yeah, that's reasonable. And it seems like RuPaul has done sort of the same thing in this case, that he didn't necessarily think it was going to be an issue and just sort of freely revealed it. Like you say, Ollie, it's a shame to some degree. I think it's a shame that this 30 seconds of a 60-minute interview with a very prominent person has been pulled out and that the Twitterati sort of leapt on it, because the alternative, or what this sort of leads celebrities to do, is be terrified of saying anything real, and you end up with very dull, monolithic opinions that everybody in the sort of celebrity industry shares that aren't particularly controversial or interesting, or don't.
And so when we talk about implications for the rest of us, James, I mean specifically for you guys as journalists, rather than the rest of us listening to this, the implications to this might be that this kind of one place, I guess, in celebrity interviewing culture, the kind of show like Fresh Air is, where someone talks at length, lets their guard down. Maybe the interview isn't ruthlessly PR'd. Maybe they try and sound intimate and real and a bit more honest. That will now be PR'd with just the same level of intensity as every other interview.
Oh, yeah. No, perhaps we shouldn't have mentioned it, actually. Can we edit this whole segment out? Sorry. Really regret that.
Well, I hope that we continue to be just as honest as we ever are. That is it from another edition of The Week Unwrapped. Joe, Felicity and James, sashay away. You can lip sync for your life to the entire Week Unwrapped back catalogue. Our library is open. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice, and I don't mind what you're dressed as. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sarah Miles at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, frack off.